Coming up, the New York Football Giants make the release we anticipated this offseason, letting go of one Kenny Golladay. We break down the cap relief, the dead cap hit, how this maybe pertains to the decisions that Joe Schoen will make around Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley, and ultimately free agency, the draft, and of course, that wide receiver room that is in desperate need of talent. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We dispense with the pleasantries, Andy, because this is our first kind of breaking news of the offseason for the New York Football Giants, as it was announced within the last hour or so, well, a little more than that Kenny Golladay has been released by the New York Football Giants. We'll get into the details, but okay, I'll give you this. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing great. Listen, it was a big win today in the Mac household because I thought daycare and school was going to be canceled. They just put it on a little bit of a delay. It's a game changer for anyone that has kids out there. It's on the razor's edge of like whether or not your day is completely ruined or not based on whether school's open. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, and it's all about playing with blocks and finger painting, some snack time, and that can really throw off your day to day. Bottom line is the New York Football Giants do release Kenny Golladay. So we've talked about this over the course of this offseason. We talked about it during the regular season. We talked about it last offseason because it was a problem hanging over the New York Football Giants' head. What I do find interesting about it is that the Giants, who did not go with the post-June 1 designation, meaning they saved $6.7 million on the 2023 salary, and Golladay will be completely off the books in 2024. The Giants take a $14.7 million dead money hit with the release. But as we know, it's certainly a better option than having the $21.4 million cap hit on the books for the New York Football Giants. So we'll talk about what it means, or what we think it can mean. But are you surprised that in the short term, the Giants went the route that Joe Schoen went the route of, yes, cap money now, but there was a very viable option to take less of a dead cap hit if you designate him for the post-June 1, but you don't have access to that money, as we know, in the immediate?
Yeah, so that's the delicate balance that Joe Schoen has to make in all of this. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about Kenny Golladay in a second. But the money actually didn't surprise me. If you understand Joe Schoen's track record so far with the Giants and what he's trying to accomplish, we may say like, oh, he went for the money, the short money now. He could have held out until June 1st. But really, if he waited till June 1st, it would have just pushed additional dead cap into next season.
Yeah.
And Joe Schoen doesn't like kicking the can down the road. He always looks at it and says, if I can make the decision now without putting too much, challenges on this team, let's take it now so that we're in better financial shape, so that we have more flexibility moving forward. So to me, this was Joe Schoen looking at it and saying, okay, we're over 50 million in cap space now once Kenny Golladay gets released on March 15th. And you know what? We're in good financial health. Why kick $6.7 or $7 million next year when we can absorb it now and be better shape next season when we may be competing for a larger, bigger picture, goal?
Yeah, 100%. So I get wanting that relief, and we'll touch on free agency. We'll touch on the Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley of it all as well. But to your point, though, too, Kenny Golladay, man, 26 games as a New York Football Giant, 43 career receptions as a New York Football Giant. Is going to finish with just a hair over 600 receiving yards, 1 touchdown that came, as we know, at the back end of this past season. I mean, there's no real reason to say, what do you take away from what Kenny Golladay was as a Giant? It was a massive disappointment. It's a holdover from the Dave Gettleman era. I'll frame it in this way, because I'm not here to throw dirt on the grave of Kenny Golladay. He's still just 29 years old. Is his career over, or do you think that he can go out there and maybe catch on with the team and spend a season reclamating his reputation a little bit?
Yeah, like you said, listen, Kenny Golladay was a swing and a miss by a previous regime.
That's right.
For the Giants. There's just no getting over that. And listen, whether or not he's a good guy, whether or not you like him, don't like him, none of that matters. He just didn't work and was not a fit under Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, especially what they were trying to do schematically on offense. What I think is going to happen for Kenny Golladay is he's ultimately going to take a 1-year prove it deal, maybe $3 million, $4 million. You've seen this happen before with big names that have gotten released. And he hopes to, maybe be a reclamation project somewhere. Maybe he shows out, catches 6 to 8 touchdowns, puts himself back in an opportunity to grab one more multi-year deal. But teams would be pretty crazy to offer him anything other than a 1-year prove it deal under $5 million, right?
Yeah, I'll be very curious to see if he gets like a camp invitation somewhere and what that looks like, or if this goes more into like the regular season and then teams kind of see where they stand. Because when it comes to veteran guys, like, take the money away, take the production or lack of production away from Kenny Golladay. When you're a veteran wide receiver, and in today's NFL, where yes, big body guys are still very much, a weapon that you can utilize, but it's not the same as it once was. I always think about, Terrell Owens, like he really, the back end of his was a pretty quick exit, even though he physically looked like a real specimen, but never had the legs to be a burner. There's another guy that was down there in Dallas, I think, for a stretch that always comes to mind. But like these bigger body receivers, once it goes, man, there's not something else you can lean back on, right? Sure, the jump ball ability is there in the red zone, but you need a team that looks at you and says, even for veteran minimum, even for a low cost buy, that says you're more worth it to have on this roster than a younger player that can maybe be productive. Or if you're talking about looking at a guy like Kenny Golladay and saying, is he a third, fourth wide receiver on our roster now? Is that worth occupying over a special teams contributor, right? Over a guy that could be a part of a roster in a different way. So I hope the best for him, but it's going to be interesting. I'll be fascinated to see where he potentially lands. And then also if he can be productive, because there is the world where the mistake by Dave Gettleman in the contract is one thing, but then underneath Brian Dable, it was, I think, schematically was always going to be a problem for him to be productive in this system as well with Kafka.
You mentioned there may have been another Dallas wide receiver that came to mind. You're thinking of Roy Williams.
Yes, he just fell off the cliff. Yeah,
it's so funny because the second you said that, I'm like, I think I know who you're talking about. And guess what? His last season in Dallas was his age 29 season in 2010, where he had 530 yards receiving and 5 touchdowns. Going into his age 30 season, he signed with the Bears, played in 15 games, had about 500 yards, 2 touchdowns, and looked like it was all downhill from there. You wonder if that's kind of the route that Kenny Golladay takes, signs a 1-year prove-it deal, and see if he can conjure something back up and maybe get himself back into good footing. But it's just tough situation, tough scenario, tough scheme for Kenny Golladay to work. Wish him nothing but the best, but ultimately, good decision for him, good decision for the Giants, clean break, and let's move on, right?
Yeah, that's essentially what it comes down to for me, as I'm just keeping an eye on any other news that's coming in here. So now let's take a look back inside the New York Football Giants roster and what it means to get yourself a little bit north of $50 million in cap room, as you mentioned, for Joe Schoen. So imminently coming up is the March 7th date, the opportunity to tag. And we know the Giants and Joe Schoen are still trying to figure out not only Daniel Jones, but also Saquon Barkley. Do you look at this as we do it in the immediate because it gives us more flexibility to say, how much money can we afford to spend on both Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley? Because I know the tag option is out there for either one of them, but I think that they, whether from player or from team, they want to avoid it for a number of different reasons. This at least does say, even if you gave the tag on Daniel Jones, there's still room. There's more room now to maybe be able to accomplish something, whether with Saquon or in free agency as well.
Yeah, I don't think this was about freeing up cap space for this year. I think Joe Schoen realized that Kenny Golladay is not going to be on
Just
this
ripping off the
roster
old
anymore.
Band-Aid. Rip off the old Band-Aid.
Let's pull the old Band-Aid off. But also, Adam, while we continue to think about how this team is going to improve, I don't necessarily know if the way it's constructed, we consider the New York Giants a title contender in 2023. By making this decision, he's giving himself more financial flexibility in 2024, where this fully revamped team maybe is one piece away, a big free agent that you need to sign away from maybe getting to that next level. So for me, it was the prudent decision to remove Kenny Golladay. Actually, delaying it would have basically been kicking the can on the cap down the road. And Joe Schoen has proven that he does not want to do that. With that said, Adam, the issue that we have is if you just we're just going to do rough ballpark numbers here. And this is why it's so important for them to figure out a longer term commitment to Daniel Jones if they want him to be on this roster. If they franchise tag him for $32 million and they sign Saquon Barkley to a 12, 13, $14 million deal, you're talking about 45, 46, 47 million. That is almost 2 or 3 million is all you have left over to be able to re-sign someone like Julian Love or look at Jihad Ward or be able to go out in free agency and make decisions. The Giants need to get that cap number down for Daniel Jones, or this team is going to look very similar with only the additional draft class as people that are coming in inbound, you know?
Yeah, and so if we put the pin on the idea of Saquon Barkley, Daniel Jones, to your point, there's still going to be limitations about how this team gets better. And releasing Kenny Golladay is something we wanted to see, but when you look inside specifically this wide receiver room, and we think about what Daniel Jones is back, now we need more talent. The draft is going to be, and we've seen some coverage there. I did my first mock draft over on Sunday night, had some fun with it. And the release of Kenny Golladay doesn't impact saying how many wide receivers you need to draft. But remember, they brought back Hodgins on a 1-year deal. It's a nice, but not necessarily this, seismic commitment to a player like that. They have Wan'Dale Robinson, injury concerns coming into his second year. Sterling Shepard, is he going to still be around? Darius Slayton, will he be brought back? Like Richie James, will he be brought back? There's this world where we're talking about 2 wide receivers inside of that room and a lot of talent that's going to need to be added. And the bottom line is, unless they can make more moves around this roster, I think the next one we could hear about would be one Leonard Williams and that seismic cap hit that he holds for this team coming up in this season. If they can't do that, I think they will, but they need to make enough room to be able to spend, 15 million in free agency on a couple of maybe a really solid number 2, maybe a guy that borderline could be a 1 as you look to the draft to get a number 1 elite weapon, depending on how things break down there. Like, they need a lot of flexibility just for this one position on this roster. And I think Giants fans should prepare for the idea that it's going to be a lot of some of the parts mentality going into one more season here before you really get to move the needle in totality on what this receiving core can look like long term.
Yeah, that was kind of the illustration that I was trying to paint by just showing where the money could be allocated. Like, forget whether or not you want Daniel Jones back. Forget whether or not the numbers that you want. If you just ballpark and estimate how much money gets tied up in them with the franchise tag and things like that, you're talking about looking at the same roster going into next season. In fact, we talk about how the offensive line was depleted, the wide receiver room wasn't that great. Like, where's the money to be able to make incremental improvements? You're talking about still having to fill 3 or 4 roster spots in the wide receiver room, depending on how many people you bring back. And if Darius Slayton's getting $5 million to $7 million in the open market, is that too much for a wide receiver 3 or a wide receiver 4 to be making? People are talking about different things, like maybe they trade for DeAndre Hopkins, maybe they look at it, elsewhere. I am in the same boat that it doesn't make sense to give up draft capital for an aging wide receiver that is making 19 million that also wants a new deal, which you add all that together. It's like, why? Clearly the Cardinals are trying to get out of that mess. Why would the Giants give them draft capital to get involved in that mess? And so for me, it's a very difficult situation. If you want this team to look drastically different, if you are not happy and say, well, the Giants should have won 6 games, they lucked their way into this, like, we need to make significant changes. Adam, the way the money's breaking down, even though the Giants, I believe, have the 3rd most cap space right now, it feels like there's not a lot of room to make any real big moves right now.
No, and that's, as I said, the Leonard Williams piece is a big part of it, because that then can shift things dramatically, right? On the books for over 30. If you bring that cap number down, like if it's an extension, then you might be able to get that thing down to 15 million, right? And then you really open some opportunities up for yourself. But is LW willing to do that? And maybe it only ends up being, well, we restructured it in a way that frees up a little bit more, but we don't actually go into the extension waters with Leonard Williams, which I'm not 100% sure the Giants want to do. One of the hardest parts, I think, for the Giants and Joe Schoen in this offseason is, what you'd love to do is have the draft and see where everything is. What did you get? What did you hit or miss on? What positions did you fill? And then retroactively make decisions around some of these contracts. The problem is, like, you need to have your table set and understand, where can we go out? What is funny, originally, this episode was going to be about looking at those Buffalo Bills and a linebacker that's being rumored that's not going to get the tag, and they're going to let him go into free agency and has ties to Joe Schoen and Brian Dable. Okay, how do we find a way to maybe free up 15 million or something in that range to go get a linebacker that really plugs and plays? And I'll ask you that, does this tie into maybe that opportunity potentially? But that in and of itself is the example of, there's 12 different things you could do when you have more money. What are the Giants going to be able to do? And how do they look at their roster currently? Where is their confidence level on certain positions, certain, areas of need that you say, could we get by for one more year? I think that's something that you and I haven't talked about enough yet is where do they say that's a Band-Aid? We know it's going to have to get ripped off at some point, but that's next year's Band-Aid, right? This year was Kenny Golladay. Next year might be interior offensive line, the extra piece, et cetera, wide receiver, blah, 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 down the line.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there's 12 different things to do. There's actually 12 million things to do with Leonard Williams, and that is how much money he counts against the cap versus how much money he's making. It's 32 million. His cap hit is 20 right now. There is $12 million that if the Giants were to outright release him, they can free up that cap space. Now, obviously, the question you ask yourself is, will Leonard Williams be able to take a pay cut, or can they restructure it to be able to get some of that money back to improve the rest of the roster? Leonard Williams is still a good player and someone the Giants would hope to keep around. But at $32 million, you need some of that money to spend elsewhere. You think about even just like veteran free agent signings at maybe 2 or 3 million. That's 4 or 5 of them that you could get just on restructuring Leonard Williams alone. Never mind what, the extensions for Dexter Lawrence and what you do with Julian Love and others. But yeah, Adam, there are so many things that need to be decided. You pointed out, you wish that you could do the draft to figure out what you need to do, but it's actually like in reverse order. You got to get your house in order to be able to figure out what to do in the draft. And then it's kind of a crapshoot on whether or not the players that you like fall to you. But there are so many decisions outside of the big ones that we will have resolutions on in the next week or so. That and I think Leonard Williams is the big one, considering you could free up almost as much money as you would have to franchise Saquon Barkley for. Like, think about how much money that actually is that Leonard Williams is costing the Giants right now.
Yeah, and it's funny. It related me back to the Titans, who they had gone out and released Luan, their tackle, who had the ACL tear, obviously, but been a stalwart, but he just had a big number. And by the way, they don't have any of the cap room that we're talking about with the New York Football Giants. They had what were they? 23.5 million over the cap ahead of that move. And then we've seen other supplemental moves from a team like that just to get back underneath the cap. Now the Giants have the cap room, but just to your point on Leonard Williams, it's like, what is the long-term prospects here? On the one hand, you could say, well, if we add in linebackers in the draft or maybe through free agency, then Leonard Williams and Dexter Lawrence, and you think about that front, and you have obviously Thibodeau coming off the edge, and that you have Ojulari coming back with some of those injury concerns. So, okay, it's all right there. But also, what if you go and apply some of your draft capital to building around Dexter Lawrence, the guy that we all assume is in line for that big extension coming up after they did pick up his 5th-year option, right? So there's this, I keep coming back to it, and I said this when Joe Schoen was first hired, and it got muddled in a beautiful way as the Giants won football games and won a playoff game. This is still a rebuild for the New York Football Giants, and simply from the aspect of there is a lot of roster holes that need to be filled. So we don't have to think about it as, well, the team won football games. They went to the playoffs last year. Of course they did, and that's going to be the goal going into next season. But at the same time, the cap management and not falling prey to the cycle that Dave Gettleman went through, to the cycle that Jerry Reese went through at the back end of his tenure, right? Dragging your team down into financial difficulties, understanding that if you commit to Daniel Jones long-term here coming up, whether this season or next year after a tag, you're going to have decisions about Adoree Jackson. And if you don't extend him, you got to go replace him, whether in free agency or in the draft, right? You have to think about the offensive line. Andrew Thomas is going to be coming up. If we assume Evan Neal's going to work out, that's coming up. And you have to identify how you're going to fix the interior of that offensive line, the linebacking core. You're going to have Xavier McKinney coming up, right? So it's like all of these things keep conspiring where a lot of talented players, but you got to get your financial ducks in a row. Otherwise, you could see yourself really hurting. And that's where I think a guy like Leonard Williams does fall into this pot of good player, but I don't know if we need or should commit to him long-term, understanding younger talent that we want to make sure we keep around.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I'm thinking about with Josh, and you're absolutely right about it still being a rebuild. Like, the team won in spite of so many limitations. Like, think about the offseason. What our best, most accomplished cornerback in James Bradbury had to get cut so that they could actually make roster transactions for the year. And like, you think about how much the being in financial cap hell ruins teams and ruins your ability to keep star players. Look at the Rams right now. Obviously, they went all in and got a Super Bowl out of it, and that is commendable. But they just released Bobby Wagner, who led them in tackles and was an all-pro. They're looking at trading Jalen Ramsey because they have no more cap space, even though most people would regard him as a top 3 cornerback in the league. They're talking about releasing Leonard Floyd. They're figuring out what they're going to do with, Allen Robinson. Like, once you get into cap hell the way that Joe Schoen inherited, you realize that you have to gut really, really good players. And the Giants don't want to go there again. And what you're seeing from Joe Schoen is making very smart decisions. He's not stacking the entire deck right now to make a run for 2023, Adam. He still has the ability to restructure Leonard Williams. He could restructure Adoree Jackson. He could sign Dexter Lawrence to a long-term deal. He could do Julian Love's deal differently. He has a lot of flexibility in where he can go and what he can do. And this Kenny Golladay situation is freeing up $6.5 million for himself next year, where he'll walk in and be like, thanks, Joe Schoen, for helping future Joe Schoen out. Now I have an extra $7 million because you weren't so anxious about spending the money because you could.
Always be careful with copies of a copy, because sometimes this copy isn't as sharp as the original. That's a Michael Keaton Multiplicity reference. If you kids don't know it out there, you should go and enjoy that movie. Honestly, that's a comedic gem. Now, the other thing would be, because you just mentioned a guy in Julian Love. When you look at the secondary, I think this is a good food for thought piece. You free up this bit of money, and I'll put 2 names into this hat. You know what the secondary looks like. Dane Belton coming into his second year, Xavier McKinney. Do you want to put this money? Do you want to earmark this to go towards Julian Love and figuring out his contract? Do you look in the wide receiver room and say, well, we could go to free agency? And I'll throw one out that played for Detroit last year in DJ Shark, not because I'm saying the Giants should go pursue him. His market value right now is somewhere around like $9.5 million per year. For a guy that doesn't play in every single game and had 30 catches last year and has never eclipsed, if I remember correctly here, I want to make sure. He's never, he had a big year in his second year in the league, right? 73 catches, 118 targets, 1,000 yards. Like, maybe there is something actually to think about for a 26, going to be 27-year-old, but that's $10 million. Would you rather this money be earmarked for maybe bringing back Darius Slayton because he has familiarity? If Daniel Jones is here long-term, they like one another, they have a good rapport. Do you want to earmark this money for internal spending or for external spending? That's the question I want to close out on.
Very, very good question. And
thank you.
I think you have to decide. Well, it's a very simple question, because you have to decide, if you bring everyone back, do you expect the team to be able to be better? Do you expect the team to be able to build with the same roster and same talent? And if so, where is the incremental, progression of this team? Are you saying because Daniel Jones is back again that the offense, he's got another year under it, so he understands things better? Are we saying if we bring back Julian Love that the defense did enough and that it's going to grow with Xavier McKinney getting, like, how does this team get better so that it's not on the razor's edge of having 7 wins or 9 wins? Like, to me, I honestly think that there's going to be some tough decisions on players that you're like, yes, I'd like to have him back in an ideal world. If the answer is yes or no, like, and it's not my money, sure, I'd like to have Darius Slayton back. But if he's going to make a 3-year, $18 million deal and he's going to cost $6 million, $7 million, at some point you have to cut it off and say, we have to go in a different direction. We have to try something else. So for me, I think you kind of have to handle the big ticket items, and then you think about where $5 to $7 million can be spent outside the organization, bringing in players that fit Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll's model more often.
And interestingly enough, because I think it's funny, I wonder if, in my mind, I think we agree with one another. But I think, to me, if I'm Joe Schoen, I'm trying to free up money, shed dead weight, and prepare myself to once again be going somewhat bargain hunting after the NFL draft.
Yep.
Right? You have 11 picks. You're going to fill holes with your guys that fit your scheme, guys that fit your need. And to your point about stand pat and bring back Julian Love, et cetera, or not even about spending a free agency. It's just about saying, I got the money now and I'll see where things fall. And maybe it is another year from now. Now, I think there still will be some type of spending that goes on here in terms of like what we saw last offseason. Whether or not we loved it in hindsight, go get Glowinski. Give yourself some stability on that offensive line. I think Joe Schoen will go shopping in that market again. Maybe it is at the linebacker spot, just to know that you have some consistency there. I don't think there's going to be more than 1 or 2 spends in the offseason. Really significant needle movers here. Remember, go back to last year. They shuffled through guys off the street, left, right, and center. I think they can do a little bit better than that this year in free agency. But for the most part, I anticipate them looking and saying, if we're going to bring back Daniel Jones, I think they want to push as much as they can for the longer term deal, not the franchise tag. I don't think they're going to end up tagging him. But that means that you are going to earmark X amount of dollars there and X amount of dollars into Saquon Barkley. So the retaining of your talent is the best talent. We don't want to lose the best talent that we have. And then we'll see where we stand after the draft, because a lot of things can change. First round pick, maybe a wide receiver falls. Hey, we just picked up a guy we're going to have fifth-year control on that can be the number one wideout for our roster, or a center in the second and third round, right? So the way that unfolds is going to dictate a lot of what Joe Schoen does. I think you'd be hard-pressed outside of like a key acquisition to say, I'm going to go address a particular need in free agency, knowing that I might end up walking into a really ideal opportunity in only a little over a month from now. So it's just, you got to be flexible around those things.
Yeah. Well, Adam, you just talked about the draft, right? And you said that there are 11 picks for the Giants to be able to figure out what they're going to do. If you assume that those 11 picks are going to contribute to the 53-man roster, you're talking about, again, we talk about this all the time, you're talking about 20% overhaul of the roster in those picks alone. Forget about signing a singular free agent. You're talking about turning over a fifth of the roster just with a new draft class. And I think people forget, like, when you do that, if you end up drafting a wide receiver, even in the fourth round, can that production at some point replace what Darius Slayton gave you or Sterling Shepard at that point? And you need to figure out how to get cheaper, more cost-effective solutions that give you 90 cents on the dollar so that you can really pay up in the areas where you are deficient in. And so that's the challenge that the Giants have. Sure, you'd like to bring Richie James back for $3 or $4 million. Sure, you'd like to bring back Darius Slayton for $6-7 million. But then all of a sudden you're allocating all this money and you have nothing left to really address the positions you need, like linebacker, as you mentioned.
And don't forget, offensive line is going to see a lot of turnover here, even just from a depth perspective. So we'll talk about that, obviously. And you mentioned it here. When you think about turning over a fifth of the roster, or maybe a little bit more, start to look and sniff around guys like Carter Coughlin, guys like Cam Brown, right? Guys that we've seen on this roster flash, or at least think that they could flash, and then have had injuries, whether it's, Darian Beavers, this is from this regime, so you expect him to come back healthy and have an opportunity. They brought in Timon Fox at one point and was playing reps. I'm running through the depth chart list here. Ellerson Smith, who will now be coming off of 2 years having injuries that prevented him from being able to play. We look at how he profiles as a prospect and think he'd be a great contributor inside of Wink Martindale's system, but he's got to show up at some point. Otherwise, the Giants can't keep acting like he could be a contributor. So, that'll be a fun one probably later this week. We'll come back in and we'll take a look at, let's go ahead and trim the fat, right? Give me 15, maybe even to 20 guys that you think should be shed away from this, and either whether it's from a fit schematically or from a talent standpoint should be turned over on this roster, and how the Giants can go about accomplishing that. So there's a lot to get done here. And this Kenny Golladay impending release is obviously the first step in the right direction of creating more flexibility to make better decisions, to make this team better heading into the upcoming season.
At the end of the day, Adam.
Oh, yeah, dude.
You mentioned it. There's probably 15 players that were on this roster last season that are no longer going to be here. You mentioned some of the different names. Just one to throw out there as a little sneak peek. What about someone like Matt Pert, who the Giants can save $1 million on to be able to put towards a veteran free agent signing? Those are the types of people that you have to really ask yourself the question, is having him on this roster worth the $1 million that you could put elsewhere to improve the roster in other positions? Fascinating questions will come up, but he's just a prime example of some of the tough decisions that Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll, and Mike Kafka are going to have to make.
Yeah. So, and you talk about it. Probably that'll be what we look into here next episode, is all the places that the Giants can save some money, give themselves some flexibility. Maybe we'll drill down on a couple of those key talking points. Leonard Williams, yay or nay, right? Dory Jackson extension, yay or nay, right? There's some things that they can do here to potentially create some opportunities to spend elsewhere. And by the way, even a guy like Dexter Lawrence, who they picked up the fifth-year option on, could also be someone that you want to reward if you believe that he is a core player going forward. You maybe want to get that extension knocked out. So this offseason could be as much about retaining and identifying who the core players are going forward, and maybe spending some of that money in areas that reward the youth of this roster that we think can be critical for the Giants' long-term success. Guess what you can do, though, friends? You know the deal. You go ahead over to YouTube, you subscribe, you follow, you turn on those alerts so you know when we're going live. I'm going to be doing another mock draft probably coming up after the March 7th timeline, just so we have a very clear sense around what they're doing with Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley. Go over to adam.armbrecht on Substack, where we're going to be putting up some player profiles, got some linebackers coming out next, and all the way through setting up for what? The NFL draft up in April, obviously. So do all those great things, man, because it really helps us lift this podcast up and continue to put out the content that we hope you guys know, love, and continue to enjoy. But as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.